Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military with Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of October of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to talk about the most important statement that was made during the previous 24 hours. We're going to talk about the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. He stated that he had practically made the decision to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. I have indeed made a decision to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, but first I want to make sure what they will do with them and how they will use them. The American president did not specify what decision he made, but the context makes it clear that Trump is not opposed to the supplies themselves and will approve them. So we need to understand that the President of the United States of America is going to send Tomahawk missiles not because everything is so good for Ukraine, everything is so good along the line of combat contact. Basically, the situation is very difficult, the situation is critical, and now the Western countries are trying to find a solution how to stop Russians, how to at least slow them down and to force them to sit for the negotiation table. We see that the Russians are not going to do this because the Russians are advancing. And for example, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, especially in the Zaporozhye direction. So let's discuss everything in details. And first, let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly. As you can see, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor, and most of the adjustments are taking place in the area of Uspenovka and Poltavka fortified areas. So, for example, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 6th of October of 2025. As you can see, and as we discussed during the previous video, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, answered the settlement of Poltavka. Basically, they broke through Ukraine defense and they captured the central part of this fortified area. Furthermore, just yesterday, the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the territory between these two fortified areas, and yesterday we got reports that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the Uspenovka fortified area till 300 meters. So this is the picture that we saw yesterday by the end of the 6th of October of 2025, and today on the 7th of October of 2025 we have completely different picture, the picture that shows us that the Ukrainian defense in the Zaporozhye direction has collapsed completely. So this is the map by the end of the 7th of October, and today the pro-Ukraine resources reported that the Russians once again managed to improve their positions in the area between these two fortified areas, which means that in coming days or hours the Russians will try to advance further in the western direction with the purpose to answer this dense network of the fortifications and then to move further in the western direction towards the settlements of Novospenovska, Yablunovka and Alyan, in the end to the settlement of Gulay Polye. But these roads of attack and this adjustment is not the most important. The most important is the information that was published today by the Group of Forces East, and this report is coming to us from the settlement by the name of Novovasilevska. Today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of active and resolute actions, the units of the Group of Forces East managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novovasilevska, and this settlement is a part of the Uspenovka fortified area. Later, the pro-Russian resources that has affiliations with the Group of Forces East published this video where we can see how exactly the units of the 5th Army of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation were capturing this territory. Here we can see everything. The Russians were bombing the settlement with aviation, the Russians were bombing the settlement with artillery, the Russians were clearing this area with FPV drones, and in the final part of this video we can see at least 3 episodes of how Russian soldiers were raising the Russian flag in different parts of the settlement. Based on this video, based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we have adjusted the map by coloring this territory, the territory of the village, as the territory under complete Russian control. Furthermore, I would like to tell you that several pro-Western and pro-Ukraine resources stated that the situation is very difficult. Regarding the Russian flags in Novovasilevska, there are even more out and were not yet published, and which might be published soon. But as is almost always the case with Russian flags and often with Ukrainian flags, the village is not under their control yet. So this is the statement. Furthermore, there is at least a contingent of Russian forces that penetrated into Uspenovka itself. This happened already yesterday. So several pro-Western and pro-Ukraine resources reported that the Russians managed to capture the village of Novosilivka itself, to cross the river of Yanchu, and most likely to capture the central part of the Uspenovka fortified area as well. So we believe that maybe tomorrow we will adjust the map, maybe not so, maybe in a day or 2 days, maybe in 5 days, but we will adjust the map and we will color all these territories also under complete control of the armed force of the Russian Federation. According to this dynamic, according to all these updates, we believe that the Uspenovka and the Poltavka fortified areas would be captured by Russians in coming 2 or 3 weeks. So all this territory may be captured by Russians, and as we can see, without almost any resistance from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians don't know what to do with this. They don't know how to stop Russians. And as we discussed in the previous videos, if the Uspenovka and Poltavka fortified areas fall, then most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time in the area of Gulyai-Polye, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. But the problem is that this retreat operation, this fallback, can lead to complete collapse of the Zaporozhye direction, of the defense of the Zaporozhye direction, and the Russians might get the siege of Zaporozhye even before the summer of 2026. You might say that the siege of Zaporozhye is too big for Russians and that the Russians will never be able to capture the siege of Zaporozhye. Telling the truth, I would agree with you, but there is one very important exception. So the siege of Zaporozhye is for Russians is the same situation as the city of Kherson for Ukrainians, and the main let's say thing that unite all these two towns is that both of them are located on the offensive side, on the side of the offensive forces. For example, the city of Kherson is located on the Ukrainian side of the river of Dnipro, and when Ukrainians were attacking this direction in 2022, the Russians realized that they have no chances to supply and support their contingent on the territory of the city with boats or with drones, because most of the bridges were destroyed. The Russians didn't have any chances to build pontoon bridges because they would be destroyed as well. So that is why the Russians decided in 2022 to fall back from this area. And I would like to point your attention that the distance between one bank of the river and another is less than 500 meters. So the river is big, but not so big, at least at some point. So of course, when talking about 2025, the Russians currently would have more chances to hold Kherson under control because they would be able to supply their contingent with drones, but then it was 2022. And when talking about the siege of Zaporozhye, the heart of the Zaporozhye direction, the distance in this case is much bigger. For example, the distance in this area is around 800 meters. For example, the distance in this part of the area is around 1 kilometer. So which means that as soon as Russians are able, let's say, to get this red line, this is not even the city of Zaporozhye, this is that just an outskirts and suburbs of the city. As soon as the Russians are able to take under control this red line, and probably even earlier, the Ukrainians would not be able to hold their positions, because from these positions, from this red line, the Russians would establish complete control over the river of Dnipro, and the Ukrainians and the entire Ukrainian army would be forced to fall back from this area. Otherwise, they would be caught in cauldron and destroyed on the territory of the city. The Russians most likely will not be able to cross the river of Dnipro to the western bank, to the western part of the city. And as for the current stage of the special military operation, the Russians most likely will limit themselves just by the eastern part of the city of Zaporozhye. But the point is that according to the, let's say, the current pace of Russian offensive operation, there are very high chances that the Russians may capture the city of Zaporozhye much faster than, let's say, the Russians finish the battle for the city of Slaviansk, because the Russians show very huge dynamic in this area. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to pro-Ukraine resources, the Russians began offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Alexeyevka. Today, pro-Ukraine resources, as you just seen, added a gray zone exactly in the direction of the settlement, which means that most likely the first sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armed force of the Russian Federation managed to answer the southern part of the settlement of Alexeyevka and to dig in deeper on the territory of these farms and these barracks. The Russians, before this offensive operation, bombed the territory of Alexeyevka with multiple launch rocket systems. Right now, in front of your screens, we can see the artillery preparation. So this is the situation in this area, and as we can see, the situation is very difficult, most of all for the armed force of Ukraine. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, and would see that according to information we have, the southern part, the southwestern part, and the southeastern part of the city of Pokrovsk have collapsed completely under the pressure of the armed force of the Russian Federation. As of the end of the 7th of October of 2025, we still haven't received anything that can confirm that the updates that were provided by pro-Russian resources are correct, but it seems that this information is the reality. This situation is the reality that Ukrainians are living in. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to break through Ukraine defense along the railways and to answer the industrial zone, which is located in the northwestern part of the city. As we discussed, if Russians can capture this territory, the Ukrainians most likely would be forced to fall back further in the northern direction with the purpose to control this residential area. But Russians most likely will start moving right after and further after Ukrainians with the purpose to secure completely the northwestern part of the city of Pokrovsk. And if Russians capture this territory and the city of Pokrovsk along Svobody Street or Olega Koshovova Street, this will lead not to operational encirclement. The operational encirclement will begin when Russians capture the industrial zone. But if Russians answer this red line, this is going to be a cauldron for the armed forces of Ukraine, for the entire contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the city of Pokrovsk and the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. As of now, it's very difficult to say the exact number of Ukrainians that are currently located here, but most likely we are talking just about several thousands. Obviously, we're not talking about 20 or 30,000. We're just talking about maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4,000 soldiers that are currently located here. But obviously, by the time the Russians get this part of the city of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians, of course, would be forced and would try to minimize the number of their forces in this area. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northeastern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. According to information we have, a turning point in the battle for this territory has been passed by Russians. The Russians managed to take the initiative completely in their hands. Currently, the Ukrainians can't do anything with the Russian counter-offensive operation or with the second wave of the Russian breakthrough offensive operation. And the most important that I would like to point to attention is that the Russians in this area began using armored vehicles and tanks. Telling the truth, I haven't seen this number of tanks and armored vehicles involved in the offensive operation by Russia probably since the end of 2024. The Russians for some reason decided not to use them, probably due to FPV drones and their effectiveness. But now we see that the Russians are returning back to these tactics, which means that most likely either the Ukrainians are not able to show any resistance in this area, now they will just fall back from this direction, or the Russians managed to concentrate thousands of tanks and vehicles and now they can start using them once again along the entire line of combat contact. Today we got reports that Ukrainians lost control over the settlement of Pokrovsk. The Russians managed to recapture completely the settlement of Novotoretsk, and now the Ukrainians are retreating from the settlement of Volodymyrovka. The Russians managed to restore control over every single square kilometer they lost during the Ukraine counter-offensive operation that started in August of 2025. The Russians continue advancing, and most likely in coming days or maybe even hours, the battle for the city of Shakhova will begin. If Ukrainians lose control over the settlement by the name of Shakhova, we believe that this is going to be a signal about complete collapse of Ukrainian Donbas defense operation. The Ukrainians are trying to counterattack, but everything that comes to the line of combat contact are being destroyed by Russia immediately. In this video, we can see another tank that was sent by Ukrainians, but as soon as the tank entered the line of FPV drone, Russian FPV drone operators' activities, this tank was immediately destroyed. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Konstantinovka. The Russians had a very long operational pause in this area. After the Russians entered the Konstantinovsky dacha, which are located in the southeastern part, the Russians stopped. And according to information we have, the Russians were concentrating their forces and they were trying to collect a critical mass. And most likely a few days ago, the Russians managed to finish this concentration, managed to create a critical mass, and now the Russians launched another major offensive operation, this time with the purpose to answer the city of Konstantinovka or to answer just the city limits. Today we got report that the Russians improved their positions to the northeast of the settlement of Yablunovka. So this dense network of fortifications was captured by Russians. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians secured the settlement of Kliban-Byk completely. So Ukrainians, according as for now just to pro-Russian resources, lost their foothold to the south of the Kliban-Bytsky water reservoir. Furthermore, we have this adjustment. As you can see, the Russians managed to improve their positions and they captured also lots of trenches and strongholds in the fields. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Ivanopolye, Plishivka, and the Russians are moving further. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians also were trying to stabilize the situation in this area by sending additional vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles with the purpose to stabilize the situation. But everything that entered this territory was immediately destroyed by Russian FPV drones. So the situation is very critical. Furthermore, as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we received lots of videos from the city limits of the city of Konstantinovka itself. The Ukrainians are trying to bring some forces, or maybe they're trying right now to evacuate personnel and soldiers, but once again, everything that enters this territory is being destroyed by Russia immediately. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sivers direction. Currently, the Russians began the artillery preparation. Now the Russians are bombing with all types of calibers. They have the city of Slaviansk. The city of Slaviansk is the main logistic and military hub for the armored forces of Ukraine on the line between the towns of Liman and Siversk. The Russians began bombing and attacking this territory. During the previous 24 hours, lots of explosions were recorded. Some warehouses and ammo depots were destroyed by Russia. The secondary detonation was recorded as well. Furthermore, the Russians continue offensive operation with the purpose to break through Ukrainian defense of the southern part of the city of Siversk through the settlement of Zvanovka. The Russians are trying to break through Ukrainian defense in the city of Siversk from the northeast. As of now, it's still a big puzzle where exactly the Russians are going to answer the city of Siversk the first time. Maybe from the south, maybe from the northeast, maybe from the west at all. The Russians also continue assault operation on the settlement of Dronovka. So, telling the truth, there are lots of settlements, lots of villages around the city of Siversk and Liman, but we entered the situation when the fall of just one settlement can lead to complete collapse of the entire defense. If the village of Zvanovka falls, the Russians would be able to move further and to answer the city of Siversk. If the settlement of Dronovka falls, the Russians will be able to answer the city of Siversk. If the village of Yampol falls, the Russians will answer Liman. If the settlement of Drobyshevo falls, the Russians will answer Liman as well. So we came to the the part of this offensive operation when everything is decisive, when every single square kilometer could be decisive and can resolve the future and the destiny of this direction as well. Now let's talk about the Kupiansk direction. The situation for Ukrainians here is also very critical. Today, several pro-Russian resources, probably and most likely every single pro-Russian resource, reported that the western part and the northwestern part of the city of Kupiansk have fallen. The Ukrainians, there are lots of pockets, lots of cauldrons that were created by Russia. The communication between Ukrainian squads and contingents are disrupted. Ukrainians are not able to stabilize the situation. situation, and now the Ukrainians are forced to fall back to the eastern bank of the river Oskol with the purpose to regroup themselves and then to retreat back to the western bank, but this time through the settlement of Kupinsk-Uzlovoy. But the problem is that Russians have already established complete FPV drone control over the main supply lines and logistic. Ukrainians can't bring anything to the line of combat contact because, as we discussed and as I told you in the previous episodes, if everything enters this territory, then this will never be able to leave this territory again. So this is, for example, what exactly is happening with vehicles when they enter another kill zone. Here we can see how Ukrainians were trying to bring some forces to the line of combat contact, but as soon as the Russians discovered the vehicle, they destroyed this vehicle immediately with at least 3 FPV drone attacks. The situation in this region is very difficult for Ukrainians, and they don't know how to stabilize the situation here as well. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.